All right, guys, getting into section 2 of chapter 2, and we're dealing with solving one-step equations. Now, previously, you translated sentences into equations, and now we're going to solve equations by using addition and subtraction. And then we're going to solve equations by using multiplication and division. All right, just a couple pieces of vocabulary, what it means to solve an equation and what it means when you have something called equivalent equations. So first thing we're going to talk about in this video is how to solve equations using addition and subtraction. And then in the next video, we're going to talk about how to use or solve equations using multiplication and division. So in an equation, the variable represents the number that satisfies the equation. To solve an equation means to find the value of the variable that makes the equation true. So the process of solving an equation requires assuming that the original equation has a solution and isolating the variable with a coefficient of 1 on one side of the equation. Each step in this process results in equivalent equations. Equivalent equations have the same solution. So basically, every time you take a step towards solving the equation, the step that you take has to produce an equivalent equation. And we'll show you the rules for doing that. So the addition property equality basically says that if you add the same thing to both sides of an equation, the equation still is true and it produces an equivalent equation. So for example, if you have 14 equals 14 and you add 3 to both sides, it produces an equivalent equation. If you have -3 equals -3 and you add 9 to both sides, it gets 6 equals 6, which is still an equivalent equation. So we can use this fact or this property to solve equations. So for example, if I have c minus 22 equals 54, you could think of that as what number minus 22 equals 54. Well, what we want to do is isolate the c on one side and get everything else on the other side. So we want to, in effect, get rid of the minus 22. So what do? How do you get rid of subtraction by 22? Well, you're going to want to add 22 to both sides. Now you can do this horizontally or vertically. I prefer the vertical method. If you prefer horizontal, that's fine. Doesn't matter to me. So if you add 22 to both sides, it produces an equivalent equation. And these 22s right here will cancel each other out because one's minus 22, one's plus 22, and you get c equals 76. Now the vertical method, all you do is you just add the 22 underneath on each side, and I just prefer that because I can vertically add a little bit better. Okay, and you still get c equals 76. Forgot to clear that. All right, here's a couple for you to try. Go ahead and pause the video and hit play when you're ready. All right, we're back. So 113 equals g minus 25. Vertically, I would just add 25 to both sides. These cancel, and I get 137 equals g. And there we go. On this side, I would add 87 to both sides. Now be careful with your signs here. You would have j equals 84. Because -3 plus 87 equals 84. Just be careful when you're adding and subtracting integers that you do them correctly. Okay? All right. So similar to the addition property of equality is the subtraction property of equality, and that can also be used to solve equations. And basically the same thing is true with the subtraction property of equality. If you subtract the same thing from both sides of an equation, it produces an equivalent equation. So for example, if you have 87 equals 87 and you subtract 17 from both sides of them, then you get an equivalent equation, 70 equals 70. Likewise, if you have 13 equals 13 and you subtract 28 from both sides, you'll get the equivalent equation, -15 equals -15. All right, so let's solve this one. 63 plus m equals 79. What do we need to do to get m by itself? Get rid of the 63. Since the 63 is positive, we're going to want to subtract 63 from both sides. And again, you could do this horizontally or vertically, whatever you're more comfortable with. So we get rid of the 63 by subtracting 63 from both sides. So you have m equals 16. Vertically, you would just add, or excuse me, subtract the 63 underneath on both sides and get m equals 16 that way. Okay? Now, to check them, you take the solution and replace it in the original equation that you started with before you did anything to it and see if it works. So we're going to substitute or replace the m with a 16, and 63 plus 16 equals 79. Now, you may think that this is pretty straightforward, this is pretty simple. Yeah, but we start here in each section, we're going to build on top of this to the point where we can solve some pretty complicated equations and be pretty confident that we're getting the right answer. Okay, here's a couple for you to try. Go ahead and pause the video and hit play when you're ready. All right, we're back. So the first one, you want to get rid of the 27 to isolate the k. So subtract 27 from both sides, and you would get k equals 3. Now if I check that, 27 plus k, which is 3, equals 30, and 30 equals 30. So it works. All right. Now negative 12 equals p plus 16. You're going to subtract 16 from both sides. These cancel, and you get negative 28 equals p. And let's check it. Negative 12 equals p, which is negative 28, plus 16. So you have negative 12 equals negative 12. Now, if you get a little confused adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers, one of the rules that you can follow is that if the signs are the same, so like negative 12 minus 16, let me show you. Let me just take a sidebar here. Negative 12 minus 16. You can change any subtraction problem into addition by doing something called keep, change, change. You keep the sign of the first number, and then if it's subtraction, you change it to adding a negative, okay? So here's the rule. When you're adding, if the signs are the same on the numbers, you add the numbers and keep the sign. So 12 and 16 equals 28, and you keep the negative. The reason is because you're adding two of the same kinds of numbers. If you're adding two negative numbers, the answer is going to be negative. If you're adding two positive numbers, the answer is going to be positive. Don't confuse this with the rules for multiplication and division of positive and negative numbers. Okay, so let me erase this. If the signs on the numbers are different, so let's say negative 12 plus 16. Okay, it's already addition, and one's positive and one's negative. You subtract the numbers and keep the sign of the bigger number. So 16 minus 12 would be 4, and the bigger number is 16, so it would be a positive 4. Okay, you see how in negative 12 plus 16, it's kind of like you have more positive numbers or a larger positive number than you have of a negative number, so the answer is going to be positive. Likewise, if I had 12 plus negative 16, like that, here again, I'm adding two numbers that have different signs. So when you're adding numbers with different signs, you subtract the numbers. So 16 minus 12 is 4, but keep the sign of the bigger number because that number is going to have more of an effect on the answer. Okay, so you could change any subtraction problem into addition by doing keep, change, change. And whether your problem it was changed to addition or started as addition, if it's an addition problem, there's two rules. That's all you have to remember. If the signs are the same, you add the numbers, keep the sign. If the signs are different, you subtract the numbers, keep the sign of the bigger. Okay? So if you follow those rules, and that only works for adding and subtracting, not multiplication and division. All right, that's it for this video. Please stay tuned. In the next one, we're going to talk about how to solve equations using multiplication and division, and we'll see you there.